Hi, everyone. For those of you who haven't met me yet, my name is Kurt Roney. I'm a professor of strategic management here at the University of Mount Olive. In this video, I'm going to discuss some methods for strategic management implementation. We know a lot about strategic management and much has been written about it. But when it comes to implementing strategy, we're not quite as smart. We don't have a large literature on implementation of strategy, and not nearly as much is known about strategy implementation as about the theory of strategic management, formation of goals and strategy, and so forth. But when it comes down to making strategy happen, implementing strategy, we just don't know as much as we do about forming strategy. So the purpose of this video is to provide you with a little more information about this very unrefined topic of strategic management. And to help me do that, I'm going to use some PowerPoints. If you've seen my lectures before, you know I use a lot of PowerPoints, but my hope is that you will be able to print those PowerPoints off and review them after the lecture is over and use them to prepare for quizzes and tests, and perhaps even to review them when you're actually trying to do strategic planning. So with that, let me see if I can recover these the PowerPoint slides. I often have difficulty doing this. I don't know why, but for some reason I do. Well, there we are. It came out just fine. So here we go, talking about making strategy happen or implementing strategy. We're going to start with just a few basic concepts, a couple of which I've already shared with you. As you may know, I spent a great deal of my career both in doing strategic planning as a manager, as vice president of corporate planning at Phillips Industries, and among other things, I was the first corporate planning manager at Holiday Inn back when it was in its heyday. Later on, I managed a consulting firm that worked with managers all over the United States and several countries to do their strategic planning. And wherever I went, my impression was that when managers formed strategic plans and they did their planning, they just were sure that when they came up with this plan and these strategies that they were just so good, they just had to happen and make a lot of money for their companies. And of course, what turned out was nothing nearly as gratifying as that. In fact, I came to form the opinion that there's no such thing as a self-fulfilling strategy. You've got to figure out how to make that strategy happen. That's what implementation is all about, and it's much different than forming strategy. Much different skills are required. It's a much more nuts and bolts, down to earth kind of a discipline. And frankly, the success rate in strategy implementation is not very good. Studies have been done and found that perhaps 20 or 30% of strategies actually get implemented as intended. That's not a very good hit rate. It's not a very good success rate. And so we need to do a lot more to refine our skills in strategy implementation. Unfortunately, as you can see in item B here, not much is known about implementation methodology. there's a lot of possible devices, possible methods that can be employed to implement strategy, but they haven't all been brought together as a methodology for strategy implementation. Later in this lecture, I'm going to try to share some of those with you, but strategy or implementation really just comes down to one thing, and that's making strategy happen. The real question is, why is implementation so difficult? And that's not the slide I wanted to use. Okay, here we go. Here's a little drill that I used to use as a consultant to share with some of my clients and colleagues just what is required for a firm to gather the skill and ability to implement strategy. And I'll just run through these questions with you real quickly. First, is there a documented plan with explicit goals and strategy? And this was far from a scientific study. This was just my partners and I answering the questions as we went along. And we gave ourselves pretty good grade on that. We said 90% of our clients have specific goals and strategies. But if there isn't an explicit strategy, then you can't implement a strategy very well and test your strategy for effectiveness of goals accomplishment. So the second is strategy specific with respect to instrumental activities. Does it spell out what has to be done to make the strategy happen? And now we're talking about a little lower success rate, maybe 80%. But instrumental activities are what I call the quanta, the smallest element of strategy. And if they're not specified, then the nature of resource requirements to fulfill strategy are unknown. You've got to spell out what you need to do in order to identify what you need to do it with. And resources are the wherewithal, in fact, of performing instrumental activities. So you got to have those instrumental activities, and you got to have and you must specify the resources that will be required to do that work with. Next, the question was, is strategy awareness firm-wide, or is it just a top management secret? There our results were, frankly, I've got a 70% on this scorecard, but that's a pretty generous rating. When you get down into the basic organization, I frequently found that members of the organization who actually had to implement the strategy didn't know a whole lot about it, if anything. So 70%, call it 2/3, but it's not nearly as widespread awareness of strategy as it should be. But without firm-wide strategic awareness, it's not possible to enlist the insight and innovation of firm members to implement strategy effectively when the environment changes unexpectedly. And that certainly is going to happen. And very often, members of the organization, if they know what the objectives of strategy are able to adapt and make the necessary changes quickly in order to keep the firm pursuing its objectives effectively. But of course, if they don't understand or aren't even aware of strategy, it's hard for organization members to do that. And then do firm members have the sufficient skills? And we're going to be going over skills quite a bit as we go through this lecture. But if folks are not competent to implement strategy, then that's a critical failure factor, a concept with which you should be familiar by reaching this stage of the course. And then willingness. Ability is one thing, willingness is another. And I can tell you, having worked with many companies around the world, that sometimes management develops strategies that the organization members, for one reason or another, just don't want to implement. The reasons could be cultural, for instance, if a lot of folks have come into the firm from another country or another culture, or even another part of the same country. So many companies in the United States began in the Northeast, but when they set up large organizations and operations in the Southwest, there were big cultural changes, and very often the folks who were asked to implement the strategy didn't have a real good feel for that. So do the firm members accept the objectives? Is the strategy consistent with their culture? Do members of the organization really want the strategy to succeed? Even when the members of the organization are able to take strategic action effectively, they may not be willing to do so. So here's a little exercise, and again, far from a scientific study, but it's meant to simply take the answers that we just got and realize that, you can't rely on just one answer. You have to satisfy each one of these requirements. And so 90% of the firms have specific goals and strategy. 72%, I'm sorry, 80% have are specific with regard to instrumental activities and strategies, but 80% of 90 is 72. Is strategic awareness firm-wide? If you've got 70% of that 72, you end up with 50%. If 65% of the organization members have the sufficient skills, then of that 50%, you're going to be left with 33%, a third of the organization. And when it comes down to willingness and ability, 60% was our rating for that, and a third of 60% is 20%. And that coincides with research. When these slides were prepared, that seemed to demonstrate that only about 20% of strategies, formal strategies and strategic plans got implemented. Now, since then, the batting average has gone up a bit according to some research, and now perhaps maybe we're up to 30 or 33%, but certainly not 50. So if you think about it, that's not much of a compliment to the strategic planning profession, nor is it much of a compliment to management generally. We need to know a lot more about how to make strategy happen, because at 20%, we're not getting a very good return on our investment in strategic planning. I'm pleased to say that the clients of my firm that did strategic planning with clients and the companies that I worked for all had higher success rates than this, because they developed pretty good implementation methods. Okay, so just to recap what we've been talking about, no such thing as a self-fulfilling strategy. We're going to be talking about the basic concepts next. And we're going to discover that resources, as I mentioned a minute ago, are very important, but we'll see them from a slightly different perspective. That people have to want to implement the strategy, and they have to be highly motivated to do it. When managers are forming strategic plans, they tend to get really excited about it. It's very intellectually innovating, you know, it really just gets you going. And folks sometimes stay up all night and work for long periods of time to develop these theoretically ambitious strategies and plans. But implementing strategy isn't like that. Implementing strategy really, to a large extent, just comes down to hard work. That's not the same thing as the intellectual excitement that comes from forming strategic plans. So how do you deal with this behavioral issue of keeping people motivated to do persistent, high quality work in implementation? And we find, among other things, that the structure of the organization has something to do with that, and we'll talk about that as well. And finally, leadership. Quite frankly, leadership combines those first three areas. Leaders are valuable resources, they're motivators, integrators, and they maintain the organization's integrity. So after we've talked about those concepts, I'll run through 10 critical abilities that are required to implement strategy and the 10 techniques that are often used to implement strategy. So here we are talking about that first concept, the theory of strategy implementation. And if you will, let me take a little drink here. So we need to talk about the resource-based perspective of strategy, as well as strategy implementation, behavioral, the organizational structure, and leadership, as I mentioned earlier, and then we'll wrap up this topic. So the resource-based perspective recognizes that managers and organizations need to have the right kind of resources to implement strategy. And we often are able to improve our understanding of this need if we can break resources into what I call operants and operands. Operands are static. They don't move around. They tend to be tangible. A factory is an operand, a truck, a tank, an airplane, a research laboratory. All those things are tangible and they're static. They don't move around, but they can, and they often are quite costly. And there are good ones and bad ones. There are good machines and machines that don't work as well. There are good computer systems and computer systems that don't work as well. An operant is dynamic rather than static. It's intangible, it's intellectual. It includes skills, abilities, know-how. So in the Korean War, the United States first began to use jet aircraft. And I'm trying to remember the name of the airplane, it'll come to me. But these aircraft were going to be flown and were flown by pilots who had come from World War II. The Korean War began in 1950, and the Sabre jet is the airplane I'm thinking of. So here was this airplane that went higher and faster than other airplanes, but the pilots who were asked to fly these, of course, were trained to fly the jet airplane, but they were pretty much pilots who had learned had begun by flying propeller airplanes. And over time, these new aircraft were outfitted with instruments and systems that helped the pilot fly the airplane without the pilot doing it, to take some of the requirements out of his hands and do it for him. And when they put these new features into the jet airplanes, guess what happened? Our pilots began to lose dogfights. They got shot down. So this new stuff in the aircraft actually impaired the pilot's ability to get into aerial combat. And the way the pilots solved that problem was going out to the flight line and disconnecting all this new super stuff and getting back into the airplane so that they had control over it. And when they did, they regained air superiority. It happens all the time during Y2K. When we shifted to the year 2000, lots of folks who had very large scale computers were concerned that their computers would not operate reliably because of the number systems in them. And so that was called the Y2K scare. And lots of companies went out and upgraded their computers to be Y2K compliant and basically far more sophisticated than the computer they had. Again, the people who used the computers were trained, but when these computers went across borders and were fairly complex, what happened was that the systems didn't work. I remember one case where a bunch of orders came into one of my clients that from other countries for a particular product. And as they came in, the computer would translate those orders into the components required to make these products, which were chemical composites. And then the product was made and the production operations put in packages and sent to the client, the customer. There was one problem. The product was not what the customer ordered, because inside that process somewhere, the operator didn't quite have it right and wasn't able to make the necessary adjustments. And the system was much more complex than the skill of the operator. That takes us to the second bullet on this chart, asset specificity. In order for strategy to be implemented effectively, both the operand and operand must be suited to each other. If you've got a really sophisticated scientist and he goes into a broken down old laboratory, chances are not much is going to be accomplished. If you take a very poor scientist who doesn't know what he's doing and put it into a great big sophisticated laboratory, he might blow something up. So bottom line is we need our operants and operands to be well suited to each other. And sometimes if the operand isn't as sophisticated as the operant, such as the operator, sometimes we've got to reduce the power of the operant so that the operand and the operant fit each other satisfactorily. Another thing we need is slack resources. And it's often believed by operations managers that a full plant is an efficient plant. That what you really need to do is use all your resources to their maximum benefit, and to an extent that's true. But what often is not recalled is that you need resources in reserve to develop skills for the new requirements that are going to have to be met in the future, sometimes not too distant future. So we actually need slack resources in order to adapt to changes and to develop new capabilities as time passes. So this takes us to the behavioral perspective. This is a course in itself. I think what I need to do is just try to point out some very basic ideas here. But people, you and I, don't always react to change, including a change in strategy, very well. It may be, I'm an old guy, and lots of folks in my generation who are managing companies don't take well to change sometimes, especially in strategy, because they were the ones that came up with the existing strategy and they're comfortable with it. New strategy means doing new tricks, learning new skills, challenge. And maybe they're not real comfortable with that. But you don't have to be a senior citizen to resist change. You and I resist change every day. It's part of our human nature, because of that, strategic planning managers need to deal with that resistance to change and try to come up with ways to gain acceptance of strategy, especially new strategy and new implementation methods, projects and programs and so forth. And corporate culture can play a huge role in this. I had a client in Texas whose employees over time became largely international. They weren't the North American by descent. And their attitude, the attitude of that culture, was far different from the way that operation began. And that had a big role to play in the difficulties of implementing strategy. So cultural norms, mores, can become barriers to implementation. How do you overcome cultural resistance to change? That's the one where I wish I had time to talk about, but that is a whole course. But our objective, a strategic manager's objective, is to gain consensus rather than resistance to change. That may call for, again, adapting culture. It may call for incentive compensation. It may call for teamwork when there had not been any teamwork, and so many other options. But a major challenge is to overcome cultural resistance to change. And that is especially true, of course, when we move our operations into other countries. So this is a big item for international strategy. Finally, we need to remember that our objective here is to achieve persistence in the pursuit of objectives. And remember also that pursuing objectives through strategy implementation can turn out to be just plain hard work. So we need to figure out how to get that persistence, whether it's cultural rights, as I have put in this slide, where we use social devices and or money incentives, bonuses, team incentives, piecework incentives, and so forth. But we need to achieve this persistence in the pursuit of objectives. So this takes us to the organization structure. And it turns out that a lot of work has been done on the relationship between organization structure and strategy implementation. Now that work was done some time ago, and it needs to be updated. but in a famous study, it was revealed that the strategy must be formed and identified and understood before the structure can be designed properly. Now, that study was done several years ago. More recently, but still some time ago, a more formal analytic study was done. And that study demonstrated that changes in strategy, and by this I mean significant changes, not little changes, but significant strategy changes that weren't followed or accompanied by organization structure changes didn't produce very good results, or certainly low financial benefits, as opposed to those that were accomplished when the structure followed strategy. There's another item when we talk about organization structure that's very important, and that is the notion of integrating mechanisms, studied more recently by Lawrence and Lorsch, one at Harvard and one I think the University of Toronto, and he's not with us anymore. But integrating mechanisms, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, they could be the corporate planning department, they could be teams, they could be liaison functions, they could be managers just staying in touch with the people who are doing the work. But these integrating mechanisms, and there are many, are required to make the activities of implementation hang together, integrate, and create a good end result. And what we've learned is that organizations grow and get larger. Of course, they get more complicated, and for that reason, integrating mechanisms become especially important, because the folks who are engineers or production people or salespeople or financial people, they speak different languages. They have different concepts about work. And to get them to, to play from the same page, to have the same ideas and to coordinate effectively requires the adroit use of integrating mechanisms. This is an area where we know far too little. All we know is that they're very important. So integrating mechanisms are critical to effective strategy implementation. And by the way, over time, many managers who have gained acclaim for their effective strategic management have decided that they don't want their organizations to get real large and complex. And so they break the organization into smaller units, which still require integrating mechanisms, but perhaps not so many of them and not so complex. Interesting point is that leadership, why is it that leadership and leaders in particular get paid so much? There's a lot of literature about that, and some opinions think that leaders of American corporations get paid too much. Nevertheless, it's very difficult to define this thing called leadership. But within the notion of strategic management implementation, we can get a little better idea. A leader is certainly a scarce resource. Very often the leader is the one that people come to for knowledge, to resolve a problem, to gain other resources, but a leader is a resource of knowledge and capability, authority, and so forth. They are scarce, very valuable resources. They are motivators. I'm sure that you've seen films or read articles about leaders who have been very effective and perhaps those that have not been. But I think of Jack Welch at General Electric, who helped to make the company so great. You might think of Elon Musk today at Tesla, and how he has motivated his people and so forth. But if you just lean back and think about very effective executives that you've heard about, you will realize that they are indeed motivators. And different kinds of motivation are required in different situations. Sometimes it's forcefulness. Sometimes it's collegiality that's required. Sometimes it's bringing people together, integrating them. Sometimes it's intellectual, impressing people with the importance and the potential rewards from implementing strategies successfully. All the money we're going to make, or perhaps even the security of our nation, if you're a military leader. And then integrating mechanisms. A leader, in fact, is an integrating mechanism, right? The leader is the one that brings people together, that keeps them on track, that finds ways to do that. And it's quite difficult. Not all people are good leaders. In fact, what we find out is that very good managers who are effective in operating by keeping within the lines, by adhering to rules and specifications, especially in scientific or technical industries or systems industries like electric utilities. Just imagine if managers of a nuclear power plant didn't keep things within the lines, you know, that would be scary. On the other hand, the managers are one thing, leaders are something else. Leaders go outside the box, don't they? They see the possibility for new directions, new strategies, new approaches, even a new scope of the corporation. So leaders and managers are two different people. And one of the questions that we often ask is, can a good manager become a good leader? Can a good leader become a good manager? I'm not going to answer those questions for you right now. I've seen situations in my career where both have been true, and many times when leaders were not good managers and managers did not make good leaders. There's literature on this, but again, no final conclusion. But we do know if we come across a leader, a real leader, we'll find these characteristics, the 7 characteristics at the bottom of the slide. I won't go through those one by one because it would take too long. And also, I think if you're looking at this lecture, you're in college and you ought to be able to read. And I think that what's on that list is pretty self-explanatory. Okay, one thing about leaders is that they change. Organizations can have, obviously will have to have a new leader. And there has been a study of leaders' effectiveness over time and what happens when leaders change. So the y-axis here is meant to refer to results or performance. And a CEO, as the person stays in the job over time, learns what has to be done and gets better and better. But then at some point, their whiskers get a little long, and they get to the point where they're not as effective as they used to be, and it's time for them to retire. Now, when they do retire, the question is, what's going to happen? Will somebody in the corporation be promoted and perhaps that person has worked closely with the existing CEO, and it's just a natural succession. And what has happened from the studies is that very often what will happen is that the CEO will leave at his or her peak, and the insider who comes in, it just isn't quite as good as the predecessor. On the other hand, if the corporation hasn't been performing very well, or there's no obvious successor, an outsider will be retained, recruited. And that outsider is going to have to start all over again. And as the outsider comes in, chances are that outsider will recruit new lieutenants, new vice presidents, new people that manage companies the way he or she prefers, which means that there are going to be some replacements, and eventually the CEO gets on the new CEO gets on this track of improving performance. So strategic leadership then doesn't involve just the CEO, but it involves the managers and leaders throughout the enterprise, many of whom will include those outsiders that come with a new CEO. Okay, so at this point, we can begin to talk about the methodology of strategic management implementation. And we've talked about the basic capabilities required: resources for current needs and for growth, the structure of the enterprise and integrating mechanisms, the ability of the organization to learn, the motivation of individuals. So now, just what is it that we want to do with these capabilities? So we'll talk about the critical abilities or skills that are required to implement strategy, and later techniques that can be used to draw upon these skills, to employ those skills. And you can see that there are 10 of each. Now, the 10 critical abilities are fairly persistent. They don't change much. I'm sure there will be additions to this list and maybe some removals at some point, although I can't think of any right now. On the other hand, strategy implementation techniques are being developed all the time. On this list, we have what I consider to be the 10 most important and most frequently used. And so what I'm going to do now is flip slides that break these down a little bit so we can talk about them a little bit more deliberately. So the first 5 of those 10 critical abilities. First, the ability to set internally consistent objectives. It's kind of funny, but as I've visited many companies around the world, I often find that the organization really isn't integrated. And so you've got different silos of management, if you will, who sort of stay by themselves. This was a big problem at Ford Motor Company for a long time. And so each division manager, each division president, sometimes each department manager set their own objectives, and the big shots in each of these silos would set goals for their enterprise. But those goals might not have been consistent. If one division accomplished one thing, that would require the another division not to do something that it had been planning to do. So making these things consistent with one another is a challenge for whom? The leader, whether it's the chief executive or the group executive, but internally consistent objectives. It just seems so basically logical when you look at this, but believe me, it's not such a frequent occurrence. As we get better at strategic management, objectives are becoming more consistent internally, but it's often a flaw that objectives are not internally consistent. The ability to achieve strategic awareness. We talked about that a little earlier, but what's so important is that managers throughout the enterprise have a good idea of what is required to implement strategy. And not only that, but what the strategy is. Now, there's some parts of strategy that top management just cannot reveal. For instance, an intended merger or an intended acquisition or a very sophisticated financing arrangement. But operationally, it's possible to share with management much of strategy, and management needs to be aware of strategy. As we said earlier, if they don't know what it is, it's kind of hard to make it happen. The ability to manage resistance to change, we talked about that as well, and that is a major challenge. The ability to sustain vigorous, focused effort. Strategy is not as intellectually exciting to implement as it is to form in the first place. Implementation is just hard work, whereas forming strategy is intellectually exciting. And the ability to align strategy and structure, we also talked about, there's quite a lot of literature, case histories where when structure is not consistent with the strategy, good things tend not to happen. Here are the final 5. The ability to identify and develop leaders and managers. I think that one doesn't need too much explanation. The ability to conduct projects. Project management is becoming a very important discipline. Again, it was not so important for a while, and now it is very important again. And that's because our corporations are becoming and have been quite sophisticated. But now we have good, sophisticated software systems and methods to use project management methods to make things happen better. So a good project manager can usually make pretty good money these days. The problem is there aren't that many of them. The ability to budget and monitor progress is one of those things that, again, it looks so simple when we see it here on the screen. Good budgeting and progress monitoring is not as easy as it sounds. If you want a further explanation of that, ask the controller of your organization and the financial analysts who work with them. I know of one senior financial analyst for a corporation who is responsible for monitoring the accomplishment and progress toward budget objectives. And when he gets in touch with people in the organization, the managers, to check on this progress, he is not met as a friend. He is not well met. They just assume that guy would never get in touch with him because he's going to ask them questions that they don't want to be asked. So it's the ability to do good budgeting and monitor progress is, of course, the first year of the strategic plan. That's what the budget is. And so skillful budgeting and progress monitoring is critical to implementation. again, the reason I emphasize this is that everybody takes it for granted when it should not be taken for granted. The ability to envision needs for future competences. Now we're getting into some pretty lofty management needs, management requirements. I don't have quite the right word there, but it's sometimes not top management that identifies the needs for future competences, but the people who are doing work within the organization. I think mid-level managers often have the ability to envision needs for future competences, but far less often do senior executives inquire of those mid-managers or listen to them when they make suggestions. And finally, the ability to realize when it's time to change strategy and replan. And of course, that's what people in my profession are asked to do. This takes us to the idea of implementation techniques. These are simply methods and procedures that are used by companies and managers to make strategy happen. So they call upon the use of these skills and methods that we've just gone over. And once again, there are 10 of them. At least I think there are 5, 6, 7, 8, but I think we break a couple of them into parts. But anyway, we'll break these down into 2 slides as well. But and I think maybe that's what I should do right now. Well, let me make a quick comment. Management by objectives probably was the first major step in formalizing the methodology of strategy implementation. And it met with great success. It's not as popular to talk about anymore because to a large extent, it's just become ingrained in the methodology of strategic management of strategy implementation. But in fact, there are formal methods for management by objectives. And over the years, we've sort of forgotten how to use those. Just because it's an old method doesn't mean it doesn't work. And this one does. The balanced scorecard we'll get into in greater detail, but it's a more recent development, and it recognizes that you've got to track progress and more than just financial results, that you've got to track progress throughout the enterprise. Project management, budgeting and control, management development goes without saying, teams, incentive compensation, and administration of the planning function, because we've got to keep our direction. We've got to do that stuff that we talked about with strategy implementation on a longer range basis. So here we go again. We're in this case, we're breaking down techniques by by what they have in common. So in objective setting, we have management by objectives, the balanced scorecard, and I'll just flip here real quick. This is an exhibit from one of the first books published by Kaplan and Norton. Kaplan, as I recall, was a professor at Harvard, and Norton was a managing consultant at the firm where I worked for a while, Pete Marwick Mitchell and Company, which is now called KPMG. But these guys were presented with a problem at some management conferences, and basically the managers that they met with complained that they understood that in order to make a company more valuable and its strategy more effective, value has to be added. But by the time they got their financial results, which showed the value and profitability of the company's results, it was substantially after the fact. And in any event, it often takes a long time for value that is built in a corporation to be realized as real results. So how do you build value? And Kaplan and Norton developed this approach called the balanced scorecard. And very simply, in addition to tracking the drivers of financial results, they also looked at how the corporation related to customers, how the corporation conducted and developed its internal business processes, and how the corporation formally undertook growth to change over time using strategic planning. So this became a very popular exhibit for people to look at. Since then, Kaplan and Norton have published a great deal more. Many companies use the balanced scorecard. Research results generally are favorable, but some research results have declared that balanced scorecard looks good on paper, but statistically significant results are hard to come by. Other studies are favorable. So I do recommend that you take a look at the balanced scorecard because it has a lot to offer. So that's objective setting. Next, we can talk about action planning and control. And here we have project management, the budgeting we talked about, conventional budgeting methods, zero-based budgeting, which was developed during President Carter's term. It basically asks a corporation or a department in a company to start as if, to begin its budgeting as if it were starting all over, asking exactly what functions have to be performed and what resources will be required and what the cost of those resources will be. In government organizations, this thing it became almost scary, because what happens in government organizations and many corporate organizations is that departments' budgets simply get increased by X% a year, 3%, 5%, so forth. Of course, they get changed when major changes in organization occur, but very often there's this sort of a formula increase in the budget by the amount of inflation, for instance. And if that process goes on long enough, a unit within an organization can outlive its usefulness and still spend more money every year. And so when this technique was used, it was found that very often departments and functions were not in need of more resources, but fewer. Others, on the other hand, needed a great deal more. So, and here we have again this notion of progress monitoring. And then in the human resources category, management development, teamwork, incentive compensation, very important, because strategy implementation is just hard work. You got to keep them motivated. And administration of planning procedures so that you're keeping up with changing times and enlisting the participation of managers to develop new approaches and eventually implement them. So there we are then, the implementation, 1, 2, 3, 4, depending on how you look at it, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it's not 10. Okay. Now what I'd like to do is take you through a concept that you will definitely not find in a textbook, but I think it will help you to appreciate the nature of strategy implementation ability. This came from a paper that I published some time ago. The notion here and the concept is reciprocal reinforcement. You probably want to write that down or make a check mark because I'm sure there's a question in your quiz on it, since I developed it. But the notion of reciprocal reinforcement is that these generic capabilities, the basic abilities, resources, structure, and motivation, have a lot to do with critical skills. If you don't have enough of these and they're not proper, then it's going to be very difficult to develop and maintain those 10 critical skills that we talked about. But a funny thing happens. As you implement, as you practice these critical skills, they reinforce these generic capabilities, just as when you develop and reinforce resources or structure or motivation, they tend to make it possible for the critical skills to be implemented more effectively. And so in this article, I went through some steps, and I'll try not to bore you with all of them, but let's say that we want to improve our project management skills. Well, when we do, that has a bunch of reciprocally reinforcing effects, one of which is that it makes our firm stronger in its ability to provide resources, organization structure, and motivation, these capabilities up here. And when that happens, we then have an enhanced ability to manage resistance to change because we're now stronger up here. And so as a consequence of that, our ability to implement the critical skills is enhanced. And in fact, we end up with reduced resistance of key managers and groups, which makes our generic capabilities stronger. So it goes round and round reciprocally. Now, notice what's happened. Where are the critical skills here at the bottom? Now they're at the top, and at the bottom are those implementation techniques. And it looks like I've found a way to turn them into 10 here. You can figure out how. So once again, when we can use these critical skills, they enable us to implement the techniques that we've talked about. Without the proper number of these skills, we're not able to implement all of the strategy implementation techniques. And once again, we can start with installing MBO, which increases our ability to set objectives, monitor progress, and do a bunch of these things up here. And that increases our ability to implement budgeting and controls and so forth, round and round in reciprocal reinforcement. Incidentally, a little question, which I think you'll also have on the quiz. Roughly how many of these skills do you think would be required to implement strategies successfully? Well, you're right. You have to have all 10, and you can't get out of it. Each of these skills is required in order to implement strategy at some time or in some way effectively. So here is the implementation mechanism. This is the whole thing put together. These two, the capabilities and skills, were in the first slide, skills and techniques in the second. And again, I've provided some numbers with some steps from installing MBO, enhanced abilities, increased commitments to objectives, and so forth. And you can read these comments. Again, they were in an article I prepared. But the point is that these reciprocal reinforcements are the mechanisms for maintaining an organization's ability to implement strategy. Now, there's one more very important point. Here we have generic capabilities, strengthening critical skills, and the skills strengthening capabilities. Similarly, critical skills strengthen implementation techniques, and practicing those techniques strengthens our skills. Kind of like when an athlete, goes out on the field and does whatever sport they do, just doing that sport keeps them sharp and they get better at it over time. And in order to practice those skills effectively, they've got to be in shape. So a corporation has to be in shape. It has to have the critical skills, just like a football player. Uh, it's got to know the plays, and it's got to be able to run the plays. So if you think about this as a football team, being in shape, having the skills, knowing the plays, and being able to run those plays, that's what's involved in strategy implementation. Now, do you see the issue here? Just because I've got a corporation that is in shape and has strong capabilities does not mean that I'm going to be able to implement strategy. And many times I have visited managers, top managers in corporations who have believed that just because they had strong resources, strong assets, they were going to be able to implement their strategies effectively. But as I worked with those companies, I found out that they were deficient in some of these critical abilities. And so those chief executives were very frustrated because they thought they ought to be able to go right from here to there. And it wasn't true. They had to refine those abilities in order to implement strategy effectively. And so this is the implementation competences bridge. And this is those 10 critical abilities are the lever. They're the fulcrum point. They're the pivot point for strategy implementation. Now, I'd like to change the topic just a bit and talk about planning for contingencies. And pardon me for this diagram, but I did it when I was first learning how to use graphics in Word. And this was the result. I've kept it maybe just for nostalgia. But as we go through time, a corporation's going to experience changes in the external environment, the economy, market, and industry. At the same time, or during the same time, over time, technology is likely to shift. That's been happening in recent years quite a bit. And then unexpectedly, shocks can occur. It can occur, they aren't expected. They are unexpected shocks. Our most recent one, of course, is the COVID virus. And that has really been a major shock. But we've had shocks with climate. We've had shocks with international relationships, individually, companies' relationships with customers, or new technology may change lots of the operating circumstances within a company, and so forth. So as a result of these changes, the business evolves in terms of its market position and its competitive capabilities. So we can't forecast them as accurately as many of the business conditions we deal with, but we can still identify these contingencies and prepare plans for them, not in the same detail that we prepare our operating plans, but conceptually. And then as the As a contingency becomes more likely, then we can develop the contingency plan in more detail. And in fact, if that contingency actually happens, and most contingencies don't happen, then we're ready to change strategy in a deliberate way, understanding why we're doing it, rather than responding in a panic mode, which often is what managers do when they could have planned ahead of time. So what is it that we do in contingency planning? First, assess the contingencies. Just what are they? And the way to do that, first of all, is to take a look at the economy, markets, and industry, and ask yourself, what is it that could change? How are these dimensions trending, and what is their likelihood in the planning horizon? For some industries, the planning horizon will be 5 years. Those are industries that are subject to change very rapidly, maybe don't have long-lived assets. On the other hand, there are other industries with very heavy assets, like the steel industry and the copper industry, basic metals industries, the petroleum industry, chemicals industries. Their assets will last 20 years anyway, and during that time, something's bound to change. But whatever the planning horizon is, we need to identify the drivers of change. We also need to identify as best we can what kind of changes in technology and society could occur. So we've got a number in this country of social discontinuities that are occurring. When you watch the television, there they are. If you're involved in international strategy, as I am, socio-political discontinuities are happening all the time, and in major countries. And technology, of course, isn't just changing now, but we have ideas about where technology in terms of energy, transportation, medicine, and so forth might be headed. And we're going to have to decide which of these could be the most significant to our company. We're going to have to assess them and identify those which we feel are relevant enough to warrant further study. So we prepare scenarios. What is it that we think will happen as these contingencies occur? And there are different ways of doing this. And again, there's an article that you may have been provided with, but that I published some years ago on various ways of preparing scenarios and doing contingency planning. But chain reaction is the way that we usually think of scenarios. One thing happens as a result, some things happen, other things happen as a consequence, and as a result, they produce other changes and so forth. But there's another way, which is I call backtracking. Some folks call it backcasting. But at the end of the planning horizon, we state, all right, what will have to happen for this future to occur? And so we work our way back by saying, well, this technology would be required. These kinds of skills would be required. We'd have to be in these countries, or these countries would have to change, and so forth. But we work our way back to the present. That's backtracking, and sometimes I find it to be more effective than conventional strategic planning. But either way, scenarios are stories of the future, and sometimes people get too caught up in these stories and try to become novelists. But basically what we're doing is talking about how the future could unfold. And because there are so many variables, it's often easier to write a narrative about these scenarios and what will happen over time, much easier than preparing devices such as critical path networks or detailed schedules and so forth. So we usually spell it out in words. Um, Once we have done that, we identify scenarios that look like they could have a real impact on our business and also have high likelihood. And we've got a little device for using that, which is also in the article that I published. But here it is. And indeed, if we were to plot where the external environment in our prevailing business plan exists, I would hope that it would be up here in the upper right-hand corner where we know that the impact is pretty significant and the likelihood is pretty significant because we're dealing with it or plan to. But there are other scenarios that might have an impact that is not necessary, that we don't know a lot about yet, but we think it could be pretty significant. And its likelihood is significant, but not certain. So in this case, we would plot it here in the center. But very often it's helpful to plot scenarios criticality by identifying their impact and likelihood jointly. Now, when I publish the next version of this article, I'm going to add a third dimension, and that's the imminence, because likelihood is one thing. Imminence, that is, how close is it to really happening, is another. And likelihood is, let's think in terms of an asteroid hitting the Earth. The impact would undoubtedly be a 10, pretty significant, might even wipe us out. Likelihood, according to the astronomers, it's going to happen someday. There are asteroids out there banging into planets all over the universe, and eventually one could hit Earth. I understand that there is an asteroid that's going to come close to Earth in a few years, and we're tracking it. But we don't think that it's going to be necessary to launch a number of vehicles to try to push it out of the way. But if we put imminence here, how soon is this thing likely to occur? Then imminence of an asteroid hitting Earth would probably be pretty far out in the future. If, on the other hand, we had a high impact scenario with a high likelihood, and it could happen next week, we damn well better have a contingency plan for that. And have planned and prepared that contingency plan a long time ago. All right, so we've prepared scenarios, we've identified high impact scenarios with high likelihoods. So that we need to, for the high impact scenarios with high likelihoods, we prepare responses to those contingencies. And then we launch environmental monitoring. And very often low impact, low likelihood scenarios, they just go off the screen. They tend not to happen. But high likelihood, high impact, high likelihood scenarios, as they become higher in likelihood especially, require more detailed contingency plans. And so what we need to do in environmental monitoring is regularly reassess scenarios and update them on that matrix. And then if there is a high impact, high likelihood scenario whose likelihood becomes higher than assumptions in our prevailing plan, it's time to change the plan. We're almost done, but please let me have a drink here. So you may wonder why some of these items are in red. There are 4 items: identify drivers, identify techno, socio-political continuities, prepare scenarios in response to those items, especially those that are important, and environmental monitoring. And of course, if the monitoring shows that the scenario is getting closer and or more powerful, then we'll be required to update our scenarios. But there are 4 basic functions that have to go on all the time in contingency planning: identifying those drivers, identifying techno-socio-political continuities, preparing new scenarios and updating them, and monitoring so that we can see which of these scenarios we need to spend most time on. And there is, I think, a little question in the quiz that asks for those 4 items. And so that's why I've identified them for you in red. Well, that was rather long, wasn't it? But I hope it's helped you to appreciate the nature of strategy implementation and frankly, the difficulty of implementing strategy, and yet just how important it is. Without good strategy implementation, much of the effort and money that we've taken to form our strategic plans could be wasted. And so implementation of strategy is just vital. And with that, I'm going to turn off the system so you can go to the bathroom or at least get a drink of water or something. Again, I'm sorry this was so long, but I do hope it was helpful to you. So with that, I will say goodbye.